Hello and welcome back to the course. In this lecture, we're going to talk about analyzing the company's financial statements from the debt holder's perspective. So if you want to lend money to a company or if you want to buy a company's bond, what should you do? Let's go.
Suppose you want to purchase some bonds of a company. What do you need to look for in its financial statements? The analysis in this case is really different from the analysis that you make if you want to buy shares. Because if you want to buy shares, you care about the share growth. If you want to buy debt, you just worry about getting your money back. You do not need company to be extremely profitable. You do not need company to be a fast-growing company. You only want your money back with interest. There are two key definitions in examining any company's debt. The first one is liquidity. Liquidity is the ability of the company to pay its debts in the short term. Basically, it should have enough cash on hand to be able to repay its short-term debts. Because suppose the company is sort of asset-rich, cash-poor. When the time comes, the company does not have sufficient money to repay its current debts. It will have money, it just needs more time to sell some of its assets. But it needs the money right now. And if it doesn't have the money when it's needed, then it can lead to all sorts of troubles and will lead to the company's inability to repay its debts and your inability to get your money back. The second definition is solvency. Solvency is the ability of a company to repay its debts in the long run. So that is what you're worried about if you want to give the company the money for a longer period of time. There are some ratios that show liquidity and solvency. Let us begin with liquidity first. There are two ratios that are standard in examining the company's liquidity. The first one is current ratio. Current ratio equals to current assets divided by the company's current liabilities. If you remember, current liabilities is what you need to pay within the next 12 months. Your current assets are cash, plus some marketable securities, plus accounts receivable, plus inventory and some other current assets. Why current assets? Current assets are assets that you can relatively easily turn into money. Cash is already money. Marketable securities, you can easily sell them quickly in the open market. Then your accounts receivable, you can collect them quickly or you can sell them to someone at a discount and get the money before they are collected. Your inventory, you can turn it over rather quickly. So if you have enough current assets to cover your current liabilities, then you're okay. So the sort of a golden standard is the ratio 1, but again, this number really depends on the industry in which the company is working. There are some companies that have a much lower current ratio and they're absolutely fine. And you will see examples of such companies later in this section of the course. There is also another ratio, which is called the quick ratio. It's a bit stricter than the current ratio. It only takes into account cash, marketable securities, and accounts receivable. So basically everything that you can turn into cash very quickly, like within a couple of weeks. And then if you divide it by current liabilities, you get this quick ratio. If your quick ratio is more than 1, you're absolutely free of any short-term debt problems. The next area is solvency. That's where you see if the company has too much debt that it has to repay. There are 3 basic ratios that show the financial health of a company. The first one is interest coverage. When you lend money to a company, you do not really need to get this money back. You are fine as long as the company is capable of paying you the interest. Because if it pays you interest, then it can always refinance the loan. It can repay the old loan and take a new loan of the same size and continue paying its interest. When the company is capable of paying interest, it does not have any problems refinancing its debts. So the first ratio, which is a standard one, is interest coverage. Interest coverage is operating profit divided by the interest expense. If, for example, your operating profit is 4 times your interest expense, then you're fine. Again, there is no golden standard. Of course, it shouldn't be lower than 1, but otherwise, if it's 3 or 4, the company is fine with its current debt payments. Debt to assets. What we take into account in this case is only our interest-bearing debt. So you take the debt to bondholders or banks and you divide it by the total assets. Again, there is no golden standard as to what the number should be, but you should take into account the dynamics of this ratio and the comparison of the company with its peers. The other widely used ratio is debt to EBITDA, where you take, again, your interest-bearing debt and you divide it by EBITDA. It's a very widely used ratio. It tells you how many years it will take the company to repay all of its debt using its cash generated by business. So anything lower than 4, in some industries higher than 4 is all right. Let us make the debt analysis using several companies from the cosmetics industry. We have 3 contestants: Revlon from the US, Oriflame from Sweden, and L'Oréal from France. If we take a look at their current ratio, then you see that all companies have a current ratio of above 1. Oriflame has a slightly better ratio, but otherwise everyone's in line regarding the current ratio. The quick ratio is from 0.5 to about 1. Again, Oriflame has a slightly more conservative approach, while L'Oréal and Revlon, they seem fine with this ratio of 0.5. All 3 companies have similar indicators of their current liquidity, at least for 2021, 2020, 2019. There aren't significant changes in there. They had no apparent problems with liquidity. Let us take a look at their debt to assets ratios. And here, as you can see, the picture is completely different. So liquidity is not everything. Do not mix up liquidity with solvency. So if we take a look, then basically L'Oréal does not have debt at all, interest-bearing debt. Their debt to assets is like less than 0.1. They're the largest company here. And they're actually the most profitable company, as you can see from their EBITDA. So they do not have any debt. I don't want to discuss if it is good or bad to have no debt in your balance sheet. That's a matter for the corporate finance course. Right now, let's just state that L'Oréal is very conservative. It does not carry any significant debt on its balance sheet. Oriflame seems to be struggling. Its debt-to-assets ratio is about 0.6, so it's stable at least. But if you look at their debt-to-EBITDA ratio, then it's quite high. It's 8.1 in 2019, 5.7 in 2020. In 2021, they even had a negative EBITDA, so they have to fix their business and do it quickly. At the same time, Revlon, if your debt-to-assets ratio is more than 1, then the equity of the company is worth nothing. So the whole company belongs to the debt holders. And its debt-to-EBITDA ratio is huge. It's like 49, like even negative EBITDA in 2020, 25.3 in 2021. So the company clearly has significant problems with debt. And not surprisingly, in 2022, Revlon filed for bankruptcy. If we go way back and look at the financial statements of Revlon beginning from 2017, then we can see that the company has a history of losses. They had losses from operations for 5 years in a row before they filed for bankruptcy. And if you take a look at their long-term debt, during that period you see that it is increasing. They started with $2.6 billion of debt in 2017, and by 2021 they have about $3.3 billion. Of course, they had net losses, so they had to compensate them somehow. They didn't have their own cash, so they had to obtain additional cash somewhere. But why did creditors continue to give Revlon the money? I mean, if you take a look at their financial statements, you see that the company was obviously going downhill. So isn't it too risky to lend money to such company? Let us discuss how the whole system works in a little bit more detail. If you are a debt holder, you live in a very cynical and self-serving world. You don't really care about other creditors, you care only about your own money. If you remember our lecture about debts, then you recall that if a company goes bankrupt, then there was a whole line of creditors, and money comes according to your number in this line. So if the company is liquidated, then the first in line gets his money, then the next in line, so on and so forth. And the next creditor in line cannot get his money until the number before him gets his money in full. So what happens if the value of the company's assets is not sufficient to satisfy all types of creditors? Then those who are at the bottom of this pyramid, they are screwed. So if you see that the company is in trouble, that does not mean that it cannot take new debts. Only in this case, the people who are willing to lend the company the money, they say, okay, we're going to lend the money, but first we need to be sure that we will get all our money back in case of the company's bankruptcy. What they do is that they can give the company something like senior secured debt or some other senior debt that is guaranteed to be repaid in full if the company goes bust. So if a company has financial difficulties, that does not mean that it cannot obtain the money. If you want to buy a company's bond, then you need to understand not only the company's financial position, but also the status of its assets. So you need to make so-called liquidation analysis. You want to answer the question of, am I going to get the money given my position in the line of creditors and the company's assets? So how do you do this analysis? Suppose you have a company which has some assets, some cash, accounts receivable, inventory, some fixed assets, other assets, and then it also has debt. There are several groups of debt, several numbers in line, so the company owes something to its employees. Then there is the senior secured loan, junior secured bonds, and unsecured junior bonds. How do you analyze the liquidation value? You need to assign a recovery percentage to each line of assets in the company's balance sheet. So it has, say, $100 of cash. You believe cash is cash, it's 100% recoupable, the liquidation value is going to be 100. It has accounts receivable of 250. You believe that at least 95% of those accounts receivable is going to be recoverable, so you multiply 250 by 95% and you get 237. Inventory, remember that the inventory is stated at cost. It is not a selling price. The selling price is going to be higher, so you believe that even if you sell the inventory at cost with significant discounts, then you're going to be able to recover 100% of this inventory. Fixed assets, you believe that the company has some good real estate properties. If you want your money quickly, then you are going to be able to recover it with some discount. And for the other assets, you analyze and approximate the number, the recoverable amount that you're going to get. So if you add up all these numbers, you arrive at the liquidation value of about $2,500, and then you begin lining up the creditors. And in our case, you see that the employees will certainly get their money. That's like a sacred thing. The senior secured line is absolutely fine. They're going to get their money like 100%. The junior secured creditors, they probably are going to get most of their money. And the guys who are screwed in this case are unsecured creditors. So that's how it happens in real life. If the company asks for some new money from you, or if you are going to purchase the bonds of the company, then you need to be sure that you do not buy those unsecured bonds, because these are junk, they are worthless. And if you are going to issue new debt, you need to be sure that you go at least higher than the junior secured guys. In this case, you are safe in lending the money to the company. That is how it works. Before purchasing bonds of some company, you not only need to analyze its current debt status, but you also need to check the bond status in the seniority, especially if the company has some possible financial difficulties. You can find this information in the bond prospectuses. I've attached one example prospectus to the resources section of this lecture. For publicly traded bonds, you can easily obtain information about seniority and possible covenants, so just be careful and do not forget to do your homework.
So now I hope you have an idea of how to analyze the company from the debt holder's perspective. In the next lecture, we are going to talk about the analysis, the fundamental analysis of so-called old economy companies. Companies that exist for a long time, but work in traditional industries such as mining or banking or something else. We are going to talk about these types of companies.